All right, welcome Trinity Teens and anybody else who might be watching this. And during this odd time where we cannot meet together as a youth group, we're actually going to continue our way through the book of John. So my plan is to put up daily videos going through the book of John and just picking up right where we had left off just a few weeks ago on Wednesday nights. So these will probably be shorter videos, short by my standards, we'll see. And I just ask that you pay attention, use them, dig into God's Word, just like you would on Wednesday night. And the cool thing with this video aspect is that actually at various points, I may ask you to pause the video and think about a passage, or think about a question or a particular verse, or pause and pray. We'll do that pretty soon off the bat here. So use this video. You can share it with a friend, maybe someone who needs encouragement. You can watch it multiple times if you would like to. So we're going to pick right up in chapter 6. We finished chapter 5 just a few weeks ago. And as we get into chapter 6 tonight, really the first half of this chapter, I want us to be thinking about the all-sufficient power of Jesus. And we'll look at these couple of miracles from a couple different angles. But I want to start with just one angle in this video segment. And we'll start with Jesus as the author of the miracles. Now, at this point, I actually do want you to pause the video, and I want you to start reading in verse 1 and then read all the way down through verse 21. And I want you to think about a question, both for this segment and for the next segment. I want you to think about this question: why does Jesus do these miracles? What's his purpose in them? Why does Jesus do these miracles? So pause the video, read down through verse 21, think about that question, and then press play. All right, so we're going to start off talking here about the author of the miracles, who is obviously Jesus. And hopefully you've read through the passage a couple of times here. And the first thing I want you to think about in regards to these two miracles, the feeding of the 5,000 and then Jesus' power over the storm on the Sea of Galilee, I want you to think about this is that as Jesus does these miracles, he has multiple purposes for them. He has multiple purposes for them. So as you've read through how Jesus feeds this massive amount of people, think about this, that Jesus, his point is not just to provide food, okay? He's not doing a food drive. He's not a divine food pantry, okay? He has a purpose for these miracles, and it's not just to feed people. Think about this, and we'll talk about this in the next video segment, is that the people experiencing this miracle experience it in different ways. The disciples experience and perspective on these miracles, and this miracle in particular is a different perspective and a different experience than what the people experience. All right, so he has a purpose in these miracles, and he has multiple purposes in performing these miracles. Now, I want to point out something here in verse 3, is that Jesus actually sets this up, okay? He purposely secludes them as they're traveling through. They're near the Sea of Galilee, near the city of Tiberias. Jesus actually sets up this whole scenario in verse 3. It says, "And Jesus went up into a mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. When Jesus then lifted up his eyes," in verse 5, "and saw a great company come unto him." So he purposely secludes himself and his disciples. They're not in an area where they can even buy food, as they're about to talk about. And so there's all these people, and it says they're in this mountain area. And so Jesus has set up this scenario. And I want you to notice the next thing he does in verse 5 is he actually poses the problem that they have. He poses that to the disciples. So look at verse 5. It says, "When Jesus then lifted up his eyes and saw a great company come unto him, he said unto Philip, Whence shall we buy bread that these may eat? So notice, Jesus doesn't say, hey, there's all these people, let's feed them. He doesn't just automatically go to that. I'll tell you what, hey, disciples, all these people need to eat, so I'm going to eat. I'm going to feed them. That's not what he does. He actually he poses the problem to Philip specifically. So think about that. And even this, look at the way Jesus asked the question in verse 5. It says that he asked Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? So he asked Philip this leading question, and he even offers a human solution along with the question. Okay? He even hints at the insufficiency of the human solution. He says, where are we going to buy food so that everybody can eat? So it's just, he gives this to Philip to ponder and to chew on. And so Philip answers in verse 6, or in verse 7, Philip answered, 200 pennyworth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may eat a little. So Philip follows Jesus' train of thought of, yeah, there's no way that we could buy enough food for all these people. We couldn't do that. So he poses the problem here to the disciples and to Philip specifically. And I want you to notice then in verse 6, not only does he pose the problem to Philip, he has a reason for doing this. So in verse 6 shows us his perfect knowledge. Okay? Why did he ask Philip this? Verse 6, and this he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. The word prove there has the idea of to test. So Jesus is testing Philip here with that question. All right? Now, a couple things that verse 6 clues us in on. It tells us what Jesus is doing, and it tells us what he's thinking. It says, and this he said to test him. So what's he doing? He's testing Philip. But what's Jesus thinking here? This he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. Jesus knows the outcome here. He knows what he's going to do. But he wants Philip and the disciples to struggle with the problem that's in front of them. How are we going to provide for all these people? Money couldn't cover all the food that these people could consume. 5,000 people. So he displays his perfect knowledge there. Now, actually, what I want to do here, we're going to, like I said, we're going to cover these miracles more in depth. But right now, we're just kind of looking at the author of the miracle. We're looking at what Jesus is doing here. So I actually want us to skip down to the scenario of the storm, and we'll come back through in the next video segments and work back through this miracle and a couple different other aspects. So in verse 15, it says, after the feeding of the 5,000, when Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again into a mountain himself alone. And when evening was now come, his disciples went down to the sea and entered into a ship and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was now dark, and Jesus was not come unto them. So what else is Jesus doing here? Is he's setting up yet another miracle right on the heels of this massive miracle that he just did. He's setting up another miracle, and this time the disciples are the sole focus. And I want you to notice that as Jesus sets this up, he actually separates himself from the disciples. Okay? After the feeding of the 5,000, the people want to make him king, and it's not his time. And so he leaves, and it says he goes by himself alone. Matthew tells us that he went to pray. And so the disciples go along without Jesus. So think about this. Why didn't Jesus just tell his disciples, hey, we need to go. Let's go. The people they have the wrong idea about me. Let's leave. Let's go together. And we need to get in a boat and go across the Sea of Galilee. Why does Jesus separate himself from the disciples? Because he knows this storm is coming. And he knows where the disciples are going to be. And he knows the fear that's going to be in their hearts. And so Jesus sets up this scenario that the disciples are about to be in. He separates himself in this instance. Okay? So in separating himself from the disciples, he's allowing them to go into the storm or into the situation alone. Think about that for a second. Jesus allows them to go through this alone. And this is a nice little reminder for us. No matter if you're watching this in spring of 2020 or 2025, whenever you are watching this, God knows exactly where you are at. And he knows what exactly you are experiencing and what exactly you're going through. He knows. And maybe he has even orchestrated the situation that you're in a certain way. So Jesus separates himself from the disciples. And I want you to notice another thing here as well as we continue reading through these verses, and that is this, that Jesus does not come to them until they are desperate. Okay? So pick up in verse 18. It says, "And the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew." So a big storm rises. And it says, "So when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs," that'd be about 3 or 4 miles across the Sea of Galilee. So they've been rowing for about 3 or 4 miles. If you cross-reference to Matthew chapter 14, parallel passage, Matthew tells us that not just that they have rowed for 3 or 4 miles, but also that it's well into the middle of the night in the fourth watch, or what we would say in between 3 and 6 a.m. So they've been out on the water. They're probably exhausted trying to battle the waves as they're trying to get across the Sea of Galilee. And so they're probably exhausted. There's probably some fear in their hearts. I wonder how desperate they were. But my point is that Jesus waits until this time. He waits until somewhere between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. to come find them. He waits until they've rowed 3 or 4 miles. And that's when he comes to them. So we will work more through these miracles from a couple different aspects in the next video segment. But I want you to just think on just this specific aspect of the miracles, that Jesus is the author of them. He sets them up. He makes them happen. He puts the disciples through these scenarios. He allows them to go into the storm alone. And Jesus is the author. He knows what's going on in our lives. He knows the solution. He orchestrates, and it is always for our benefit. So think on that, if you would. Meditate on this passage.